Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Sarah Miller, and I am the librarian for interdisciplinary teaching and learning initiatives at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, USA. And I'm so glad to have you all here today. I'm going to provide a written transcript of this session along with the session information. So rather than have captions, I have the transcript printed out. So if you'd like to follow along, you may do that as well. So welcome. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present to you today on considering spirituality in connection with information literacy. In the course of my work, I've experienced, as I'm sure many of you also have, so much worry and concern about why and how people are drawn to misinformation and polarized views that cause personal, community, and global harm. My colleagues have expressed frustration and an inability to comprehend why people are so willing to believe misinformation, even with all of their university training. As academics, we tend to focus on the intellectual, rational, and cognitive processes, especially when it comes to information literacy. Spirituality deals with an awakening sense of self and identity, which can be far stronger forces than reason, especially when in certain stages of personal development. This paradigm will help us look at the whole person to uncover the dynamics which can impact critical thinking and the development of the whole self in relation to information literacy. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to refer to spirituality in its broadest sense. There is no one universally agreed upon definition of spirituality, so the following is the paradigm that I will use in this context. Spirituality is something that transcends religious and non-religious labels to focus on a person's understanding, ways of knowing, and relationship to self, humanity, the earth, the unknown, and the notion of universality. Spirituality deeply impacts, whether consciously or unconsciously, the way a person or group of people makes meaning of the world and their purpose in it. Spirituality is not synonymous with religion or with faith. Religious beliefs, practice, and traditions that fall under the umbrella of the wider definition of spirituality. Religion is perhaps the most common paradigm in which people frame or experience spirituality, but it is not synonymous with the experience or the concept. Likewise, spirituality is not limited to a particular expression of faith, faith tradition, or no faith. Spirituality can be as diverse and unique as there are individuals, cultures, subcultures, and traditions. At its heart, spirituality is a quest for the universal and our relationship to it. Spirituality is also related to, yet different from, belief in that it does not require assent or subscription to a particular way of thinking. Specific tenets of belief are not essential to an experience of spirituality. As such, it can be experienced by every person, whether or not they define it in the same way, identify with specific beliefs, consider themselves to be spiritual or not, or choose to intentionally explore spirituality. Atheism can frame spirituality as well as secular humanism and other modes of being. Spirituality runs as an undercurrent which touches all the facets of human life: intellectual, psychological, religious, relational, communicative, idealistic and visionary, motivational, activist, political, intuitive, experiential, emotional, and more. It is also intimately connected with personal growth and transformation and a sense of self. Spirituality has not always had the friendliest reception in academia, whether in the form of religious belief or practice, or as an approach which can and often does center subjectivity. However, spirituality, intellect, reason, and humanism intersect in many ways, as spirituality can be thought of as an umbrella for the whole person. As teachers, we expect nuance and openness in learners and in their thinking. We often focus not only on intellectual development, but also the development of students into active and contributing citizens of the world. In the US, a focus on liberal education also emphasizes the production of a well-rounded student or person as a product of a university education. Spirituality focuses on how an individual relates to the whole. This can include how we make meaning of our lives and how we relate to the world and others through all parts of ourselves, including intellect, psychological well-being, and a sense of ourselves in the world and in relation to the unitive nature of humanity. Depending on your beliefs, this can also involve a sense of the unitive greater which transcends humanity. Spirituality speaks to the whole individual as well as the individual within their community and within the entirety of the world. Academia's loftiest goals for making the world a better place through educated people melds very well with the thrust of spirituality. A spiritual paradigm addresses major concepts which also underlie critical thinking and information literacy. First are the areas of authority and relativity, identity, community, security, and uncertainty. These concepts underlie and directly impact reasoning, analysis, and critique. There has been much research in psychology and neuroscience which addresses the relationship of these concepts to unconscious bias, hot cognition, cognitive bias, and decision-making processes, among many other intellectual and critical tasks. The areas of moral feeling, ethics, and moral reasoning are also intimately connected with spirituality. These concepts underlie the development of the capacity to envision oneself as a citizen of the world, the ability to consider different perspectives with increasing nuance, and the dispositions needed to live with compassion and empathy for others. From this perspective, it makes sense to investigate what spiritual growth models have to offer toward the development of critical thinking and information literacy. Spiritual development is closely related to intellectual and psychological development. Familiar researchers in these fields include Jean Piaget, Abraham Maslow, Lawrence Kohlberg, Jane Loevinger, and Erik Erikson, among others, who proposed time-honored models and paradigms for development. In 1970, William Perry published his Forms of Intellectual and Ethical Development in the College Years, a scheme. This model has been revised many times over the years, but it provides a basis for conceptualizing the stages that many college students pass through in their university experience. In partial response to the critique of Perry's work being focused on white males, Women's Ways of Knowing, a feminist epistemology of development, was published by Belenky, Clinchy, Goldberger, and Tarul in the late 1990s. In 2000, Elizabeth Liebert published Changing Life Patterns, which includes an in-depth look at both Perry's scheme and Women's Ways of Knowing, synthesizing them and the earlier behaviorists into a paradigm for spiritual growth. Liebert is a professor emerita of spiritual life, a Roman Catholic nun, and faculty at University of Redlands, the Jesuit School of Theology, and Lancaster Theological Seminary and the Graduate Theological Union. Liebert's book is a guide for spiritual directors, who are people who provide spiritual guidance or companionship to others in order to holistically help people make sense and meaning of their lived experience. The main addition to the previous paradigms that Liebert developed is consideration of an intellectual and psychological development within the context of a person's relationship to the universe, ultimate whole, higher power, God or gods, whatever name or metaphor a person chooses to use. The other major conceptual shift which Liebert's paradigm proposes is its focus on the transitions between stages or liminal spaces more than the stages themselves. The identified stages are referred to as balances between transitions and serve as milestones or markers rather than a static place that people remain. People can display traits from more than one stage at a time, and almost never all of the characteristics of any stage. Growth is fluid and not always linear, a complex series of stops and advances and retreats, which cumulatively constitutes a transition, which is a quote from Liebert. Transitions can take months or years. They are not guaranteed to happen, and people sometimes move away from transitions, consciously or unconsciously. It is also entirely possible for a person to remain in or regress to earlier stages throughout life and to function from the characteristics of those earlier stages. I have listed 9 of Liebert's stages here on this chart, and the ones highlighted in orange are the ones most frequently experienced by college-age learners. This is an overview, and we will look at a few of the stages in more detail. The characteristics throughout these stages range from beginning to assert one's independence through questioning processes and towards the ability to hold complexity and see multiple systems. The transitional bridges and catalysts which Liebert identifies are the act of leaving home for college or another institution, and the act of ideological self-surrender, which is a deeply personal process which involves an honest examination of one's ideals at one's own pace. For convenience, I have grouped some of these stages together as they have several characteristics in common. The conformist stage is often seen in the transition from high school to college, although it is not exclusively tied to an age range, and its characteristics can be experienced at any point in a person's life. I have highlighted particular characteristics which we often see in learners. I wanted to draw attention to the fact that Liebert does not only address the intellectual processes of a person in a stage, but also draws attention to that person's relationship to their communities, which she calls the self-other perspective, the development of their character, the way that they communicate symbolically, and how a person experiences and evaluates narratives. In this stage, you can see that people value conformity to external rules, experience conceptual simplicity such as stereotypes or cliches, and most interestingly, have a changing relationship with authority. Liebert highlights authority's deep connections to a person's sense of belonging in a community, as well as their sense of identity. In these stages, a person moves from a derived identity of shared ideals, in which authoritative leaders are validated by the individual, to an internalized sense of identity and authority. Liebert highlights some typical responses and assumptions of this stage, beginning with the assumption that the world is like one's own experience. Liebert describes this as, quote, "We are aware of the results of our perspective while remaining unconscious of the perspective which has led to these results." Another consideration for this stage is that social acceptance, belonging, adjustment to group norms are paramount, and identity formation is often tied to these groups. Along with the previous assumption, Liebert states that, quote, "A broad and inclusive social worldview is developmentally beyond the conformist person." Considering learning in this stage, learning progresses through seeking rewards and avoiding punishment, which is another quote from Liebert. A transition from dualistic thinking to relativistic thinking is occurring, and one often sees stereotypic thinking, cliches, and all or nothing statements. And regarding authority, people in this stage can often display fundamentalist thinking in that they consider authority to be identical to truth with a capital T. Liebert states that, quote, "Only when valued authorities themselves present conflicting views of right, order, or truth will this position begin to weaken. Some struggle ensues before authority will be dethroned to authority with a small a, and truth with a capital T to truth with a small t." Liebert recommends for people in this stage that they need rules and often cannot readily bend the rules or allow others to do so. We can loosen the rules slowly, giving them more freedom in the structure of the work that we ask them to do. She also recommends that we be wary of always expecting a right answer, which will reinforce conformity. Liebert also recommends that we help people to notice their own thoughts and feelings, their inner movements, and suggest more descriptive language than what they currently may have to describe themselves and their experience of the world. Liebert further suggests both intellectual and emotional struggles that a person must grapple with when transitioning from this stage. Intellectually, Liebert states that a person will realize that respected authorities disagree, and that the various groups to which one belongs demand contradictory commitments or behaviors. The emotional factors are just as important. The person, I quote from Liebert, "must decide whether to explore the implications of unruly emotions or conflicting stories despite the painful disorientation which may result from the undoing of one's worldview." And it's also important to remember that change is not guaranteed. Liebert states that some persons will foreclose the possibility of change or even regress to an earlier dualistic level. The stages which follow conformist, the conscientious and individualistic stages, are also marked by movement across cognitive, intellectual, emotional, identity, and community perspectives. Across the board, a person's sense of self is becoming more focused, and they are becoming more attuned to their own inner experiences. Their identities are still firmly tied to external groups, but they are developing a more internalized identity and authority. They are beginning to join their personal experience with reflection on others' experiences in a search for love and justice. People moving through this stage are also developing an increasing conceptual complexity. Some considerations for pre and post the conscientious stage include intellectual and cognitive, increasing self-awareness and appreciating multiple possibilities in the same situation. Liebert quotes, "Learning occurs through identification with ideas and models. This can work for good or be destructive." And for women in particular, Liebert says, they frequently distrust logic, analysis, and abstraction, and instead turn to their own experience to validate what authorities present as true. Direct sensory experience is important in this case. For identity and community, this stage involves replacing group values with personal values. Folks are moving to break down stereotypes, demythologizing former tacit belief systems. The formation of identity, the sense of self, and their inner voice is occurring. And a risk factor for many, especially women, they keep quiet about their inner voice for fear of rejection or connection with their communities. For authority, Liebert quotes, "The critical appropriation of one's formerly tacit value system is forged by interrupting the reliance on external authority and relocation of authority within oneself." In the emotional realm, Liebert says, people can feel as if their moorings have vanished, experience a crisis of meaning. They also have an increased ability for introspection. The transition requires moral courage, which is a quote from Perry, and that's involved in taking the risks of caring about values and concerns. Ways that we can help in this transition: discernment can serve as a way to navigate multiple possibilities, and this can be fraught with balancing inner guidance over outer authority. People transitioning out of the conscientious stage have a growing awareness and ability to tolerate paradox, which is in part due to a growing awareness of one's inner voice and experience and their contradictions with outer ideals and systems. Liebert states, "Moralism begins to give way to awareness of inner conflict and toleration of paradox and contradiction." She also states that people in this transition wrestle with paradoxical ways to understand an increasingly complex world. In self and other relationships, a growing awareness of conflict between personal freedom and interpersonal responsibility emerges. And it's interesting to note that this transition is often spurred by, I quote, "disillusionment with reality of life and consequences of choices." This factor is something that's obviously outside of an official educational experience that can be experienced in other facets of life. This is not only a college phenomenon, but can occur much later in life as well. In each stage, the facets of cognitive, emotional, social, communal, and sense of self interact with one another, and none can be separated out. As the stages progress, the interplay between these facets becomes more integrated. In this stage, the ability to deal with paradox, ambiguity, and uncertainty moves from awareness and toleration to acceptance and, I quote, "holding the tension and interpenetration." This ability is not just due to intellectual growth, but is intimately tied to emotional and social factors. The same principle applies to an individual's self-other perspective. In these stages, a person moves from, I quote, "joining personal experiences and reflection on others' experiences to compassionate identification with universal principles and universal community of persons." This ability not only requires an intellectual knowledge of humanity, but an alignment of emotional, social, and self-knowledge as well. Liebert indicates that most people take until at least midlife to reach this stage, although some do in college or university, and others never do. In this stage, relationships will reflect mutuality and equality. As mentioned before, there is an increased ability to tolerate ambiguity and perceive complex patterns and nuance. And recognizing that not all problems are solvable is also a hallmark of this stage. Importantly and interestingly, the ability to see oneself as part of oppressive institutional systems is an ability that occurs when much of this other awareness has been developed. It's worth noting that this ability is nearly impossible to grasp during the early parts of the conformist stage. Before we get too excited about facilitating stage change, it's very important to note a major qualifier that Liebert indicates in her work. And I quote from her here, I have the page number. Attempting to cause stage change directly can be intrusive and manipulative. This is where Liebert's training as a spiritual director comes into play. A spiritual director's work requires actively listening to others to help them discover their inner voice and move at their own pace. Transition between stages is not the goal. Self-awareness is the goal. Stage change may happen, but only when self-awareness actively develops. In education, we often intentionally measure progress across stages, as well as gear our curriculum and pedagogy to explicitly facilitate these changes. Education is often designed to provide disruptive experiences which unsettle a person and contribute to that progression. The question is for us, how do we hold these two perspectives in tension? Liebert also states that we must resist the temptation to treat the stage as a predictor of behavior. We must let each person's experience unfold, respecting what they may or may not make of that experience. We must also resist the urge to categorize, grade, assess, or otherwise punish or reward people based on our perception of their stage or their progress through it. There are two major questions that arise for me after an initial consideration of Liebert's stages. The first is, do our expectations of learners line up with their reality? Often, we expect learners to be functioning at a high inter-individual level when they may be operating out of a conformist stage. We want them to think critically and objectively, hold uncertainty in tension, make decisions which favor justice and the common good, and interrogate their long-standing beliefs and values. Expecting learners to do those things too soon in their development process can at best lead to disappointing results, and at worst, potentially have a backfire effect for their development. The second question is, considering Liebert's importance on not forcing stage change, what can we do as educators to create and facilitate opportunities for growth in this area? This is a question I'd like to address in the specific context of information literacy. At this point, I will take a small break and I will conclude this portion of the video and I will start part 2. Thank you.